The answer is not hard to find, however, to that question, because Mr. Goldstone is not only Jewish, but he says proudly, I am a Zionist. He says, quote, I worked for Israel all of my adult life. He says, and I quote, I fully support Israel's right to exist. He says, and I quote, I am a firm believer in the absolute right of the Jewish people to have their home there. He sits on the board of governors of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He received an honorary degree from the Hebrew University. His mother was an activist in the Zionist movement. His daughter did Aliyah. Goldstone says, I went into international law because of the Nazi Holocaust. That's what inspired me. And now Israel had a big problem on its hands, because for the past 30 or more years, it's honed, it's refined these ideological weapons to deflect any criticism of it and to discredit those who criticize it. So if you criticize Israel, you have to be an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew or a Holocaust denier. But to Israel's misfortune, these ideological weapons wouldn't work against Mr. Goldstone. His person, who he is, neutralized them. As the Israeli columnist Gideon Levy put it, this time the messenger is propaganda-proof. Well, now we have a problem in our hands, a big problem for Israel. If Goldstone was not an anti-Semite, and it didn't appear as if he were, and if he wasn't a self-hating Jew, and it didn't appear as if he were, and if he wasn't a Holocaust denier, and it didn't appear as if he were, and if he wasn't incompetent or a fool, and a former chief prosecutor for the war crimes in Rwanda and Yugoslavia, doesn't sound like a incompetent or fool, then the only plausible explanation for the devastating content of the report he authored was that he faithfully recorded the facts as they unfolded during the 22-day invasion. For our purposes, I think the Goldstone report is significant on two levels. Number one, it marks the end, or the beginning of the end, of liberal Jewish support for Israel. Goldstone himself is the quintessence of the classical liberal Jew. He's a renowned defender of the rule of law and human rights. And the fact of the matter is, it's become progressively more difficult in recent years for those who call themselves liberal to defend Israeli conduct. What does liberal mean? Liberal generally means, at least in the American context, it means belief in the rule of law. It means support for international institutions. It means defense of human rights. Human Rights Watch, a liberal organization. Amnesty International, a liberal organization. And as it happens, Jews are overwhelmingly liberal. In the last presidential election, about 82% of Jews voted for Barack Obama. Even among Latinos, the percentage was much lower. It was about 67%. If you factor in economic background, Jews should have been voting overwhelmingly Republican. And certainly, Latinos should have been voting in a much higher percentage for Obama than Jews. But that didn't happen. Jews are liberal, overwhelmingly. And it's no longer possible. Too much is known about the historical record, Israel's human rights record, Israel's diplomatic record. Too much is now known for people who call themselves liberal, which is overwhelmingly Jews, to defend Israeli conduct. The Gaza invasion, the assault on Gaza, marked the climax of Israel's incremental descent into barbarism. It was the first assault where there was not even a pretense of a war. You can say 1967, surely 73, 82, they all had a battlefield component. But in Gaza, there was no battlefield component. It was just an outright massacre. It was Israel's descent into barbarism. And after the Goldstone report, it's difficult, or more difficult, for Jews to brush aside even the harshest criticism of Israel, just as Israel's defenders will henceforth have a harder time shielding it from such criticism. The other major consequence of the Goldstone report is that for the first time, human rights issues have been moved center stage in the Israel-Palestine conflict. For the longest time, all we've heard about is this never-ending soap opera called the peace process. And now, human rights has become a focus. It happens that if you look at the history of the record on human rights, up until the early 1990s, human rights organizations were very fearful of criticizing Israel's human rights record. In fact, the record has been awful since the beginning of the occupation. If you open up histories now, if you open up, for example, Benny Morris's book, Righteous Victims, or Tom Segev's book in the 1967 war, they openly acknowledge that Israel was routinely torturing Palestinian detainees from the first days of the occupation. But human rights organizations up until 1990